10 Craziest Failed Military Inventions. 10. Foster Miller Talon. Another grand failed idea from the US military are those armed ground robots. The initial test runs began in 2002, and despite early signs of progress, the project was ultimately deemed a failure. The armed unmanned group vehicles include modified guns and specialized weaponry with no human pilot. The robots initially ran with remotes, but later design plans intensified with promises of artificial intelligence. This never came to fruition. A few of these modified robotic ground troops have been deployed to Iraq, but never actually saw any combat situations. Problems with target accuracy, constant jamming, and even the barrels of guns pointing in crazy directions have all led to costly problems. One industry source told PopMech that the ground robot locked up during a demonstration and continued to move forward and shoot on its own when the remote controls failed. 9. Boeing YAL-1. This crazy invention was once described as the closest thing on Earth to the Star Wars Death Star. The concept was a flying laser cannon. The United States Missile Defense Agency attempted to develop a megawatt laser attached to a plane which could effectively destroy enemy ballistic missiles. Some dubbed the plane the Airborne Laser Testbed. The main problem became the chemical oxygen iodine laser modules, which were extremely heavy. A converted 747 jet was only able to successfully carry 6 of them at once. Each module weighed around 6,500 pounds. Also, the energy concerns. For the laser to fire, the energy needed in that 5-second burst could potentially power a typical American household for over an hour. Also, despite its intense power, the laser was unable to burn through or disintegrate its targets. All the blast really did was weaken the missile's skin. By 2010, the entire project seemed more trouble than it was worth, and all funding was cut. 8. Corkscrew tank. This insane little almost weaponized vehicle was a failed attempt by the Russians to create a tank which can literally pummel through any terrain. The tank contained a huge corkscrew on the front of it and was effective in several early tests. The vehicle managed to maneuver across snow and ice terrain much easier than standard issue tanks. However, there were many costly downsides. The massive vehicle was very heavy, which made it very slow. It also lacked suspension as well as safe steering. Also, due to the tank being so front heavy, the mobile military unit had difficulties traveling over decent terrain, and the screws couldn't be aimed from side to side, making mobility extremely limited. Eventually, the Russian military gave up on the idea and scrapped the immense bulky machines and went to work on the next failed invention. 7. Hafner Rotobuggy. During the Second World War, the British military tried their hand at inventing a flying jeep complete with a rotor and tail fin. However, the massive undertaking flopped and the silly-looking contraption was never deployed. The plain-towed gliders were meant to function as a practical, safe way to deliver ground vehicles to a militarized hostile area. Designed by Raoul Hafner of the Airborne Forces Experimental Establishment, the Blitz buggy had difficulties from the very start. The lorry had trouble gathering speed and therefore had great difficulty getting airborne. Later creations based from the same model did eventually make it into the air. However, gliding speeds only reached a maximum of 45 miles per hour. The vehicle was prone to heavy vibrations, making the pilot sick and dizzy in a short period of time. The last test was held in 1944, where the unit was able to fly for 10 minutes at an altitude of 400 feet and a speed of 65 miles per hour. Still, the rotobuggy was discarded and further development cancelled. 6. XM-29. This gun looks like something you would fire at alien invaders inside of an arcade, but the object individual combat weapon was a serious prototype for many years. The idea was to have a weapon which could fire both regular bullets and programmable exploding rounds. The semi-automatic weapon was amped up with a smart grenade launcher, an underslung assault carbine, and a top-mounted computer-assigned sighting system with a laser rangefinder as well as night vision capabilities. A hefty order for a single gun. Various problems plagued this weapon early on. The weight for one was incredibly heavy for a single soldier. The weapon was bulky, making it difficult to handle, and the lack of effectiveness was the final straw for the military. Attempting to make grenades and exploding rounds to fit into the single barrel led to jamming and misfires. The whole dismal project was officially terminated in 2005 when the US Senate voted to pull funding. However, several insiders inside the Army maintain that they still feel the idea was sound and are attempting to go into low-rate productions for lighter weight weapons of of this kind. 5. Hiller X-18. This experimental cargo transport aircraft was designed as the first testbed for tilt-wing and vertical short takeoff, as well as experimental landing technology. Funded by the United States Air Force, design work began in 1955 by Stanley Hiller Jr. and the Hiller Aircraft Corporation. It was the only X-18 ever produced. The plane was largely constructed from scavenged parts and experimental previous failures. The experimental aircraft was plagued with problems such as susceptibility to wind gusts, non-cross-linked engines, thrust control, and throttle changes. The only one of its kind, the plane did provide valuable research as to what not to do when building a plane. 4. Rocket bullets. During the 1960s, MB Associates went into development for the gyrojet, an experimental gun which would fire tiny rockets rather than bullets. This crazy weapon even managed to ascertain a cameo in the James Bond film, You Only Live Twice. Despite this cameo, the gun contained a large list of problems. For instance, the rocket bullets were only able to pick up speed as they exited the barrel of the gun, so firing the gun at close range became a useless endeavor. The massive bullets also had a devastating tendency to clog up inside the gun, causing the weapon to jam frequently. Also, the bullets, once at full speed, would sometimes veer off random directions, making the accuracy of the gun anything but. The gun, along with its crazy designer destructive rocket bullets, was quickly abandoned and forgotten. 3. Scooter cannon. This crazy failed weapon experimentation took place during the Vietnam War. French forces were lacking money for advanced equipment and ammunition, so they had to improvise. The French military came up with the harebrained idea to mount a 75mm cannon to an electronic scooter to take down the Viet Cong army. This crazy-looking militarized vehicle was mainly utilized by paratroopers during the 1950s and into the early 1960s. However, even before the war was over, it became obvious that this mode of weaponized travel had a long list of problems. For starters, there was no protection of any kind offered for this terrain vehicle, making the scooter cannon a literal giant sitting duck. Also, the heavy mounted weapon made balance on the tiny motorized bike extremely difficult, and eventually the failed experiment was scrapped completely. 2. Flying tanks. It's a bird, it's a plane, it's a tank strapped to wings? This brilliant failed idea came from several military factions. The Soviets tried attaching tanks to parachutes, which would drop down from the sky and rain doom on their enemies. But you know pesky physics got in the way. The Airbuses, as they were called, were quickly scrapped. In 1941, the United Kingdom tried their hand at flying tanks with the Carrier wing glider, but gliders fared just as poorly. Tanks are quite heavy after all. The Imperial Japanese Army came the closest. In 1943, Special No. 3 flying tank was developed. It had detachable wings and could be transported by heavy gliders or towed by an aircraft. 3 tank transport gliders were deployed to the Philippines during 1944, but the big bulky machines had to be so lightweight to fly that by the time ground troops arrived, these tanks became easy prey. The Japanese abandoned the entire program before production for any more began. 1. Rocket belt. If you've ever seen the movie Rocket Man, then the idea of a miniature rocket strapped to your person so you can fly or at least jump really high might sound like a nifty idea. Unfortunately, in actual practice, this experimental technology was a big flop. In 1961, this experimental design was demonstrated for President John F. Kennedy at Fort Bragg. The pilot demonstrated some exponential maneuvers, and the rocket belt did lift his person steadily from the ground and land him safely several hundred feet away over a body of water. The final product of this rocket pack was able to carry a man a little over 9 meters high, reach speeds of 16 kilometers an hour, and have a flight time of around 20 seconds, which delivered a range of around 120 meters. However, due to landing difficulties, the short flight duration and range of the overall lack of perfect control over the rocket-powered device, the military lost interest. The contract was canceled and the invention forgotten. That is, until now, of course.